I am now currently director of the British Sauna Society, but I'm actually going to be talking about a project that I was involved in before, which is now the community sauna bars. We moved into this very beautiful old public bars building, and when I was there, because I love history, I was like, I have to look into this. So I went down to the Hackney archives, and I can tell more of a story about how communal bathing is coming back. So firstly, the rise. So why did Hackney end up with so many baths? Why did they then all go? They all disappeared around the end of the middle of the last century. And the return. So again, looking at this new sauna wave that is coming back into Hackney. So this is a section in time. This is from the 1950s, and this is a list of all of the public bars that they were talking about in Hackney. And I think it's important to actually begin on a bit of a clarification about what this idea of the word bars means. Back then, it had a much wider term of use than we have now. So a lot of things were called bars. There's obviously the bars that you would have on your own, and they used to be called slipper bars back in those days. They had Turkish bars, which were the kind of hot, steamy, more like saunas. And there were also swimming bars, so we would never really use that term anymore, so it'd be more of a swimming pool. For some reason, I was like, there seemed to be some notable omissions on this. I think Haggerston Bars is probably the most notable one, and I have a feeling it's because it was primarily what they would call a swimming bath. It doesn't seem to be covered on this. So we have probably which was the biggest one, which was the Central Bars, so that's in central Hackney. And we've got the Englefield Road Bars, and that's over in De Beauvoir. And we've got the Shacklewell Lane Bars, that's over up near to Dalston. And then we have the Eastway Bars, which is actually going to be the focus of this talk. So to understand this and how all of these bars came together, I'm actually kind of looking at this as a bit of a focus to really understand what happened at the Eastway Bars, what was going on with the people around it at the time, how did it come into being. So in order to understand more about why they came there, we have to go back in time to really understand how the people of Hackney began to change, what their needs were, what was their health like, what was the disease, what were the pressures on them. So this is Hackney in its very, very early days. This is 1795. So back then, it was just a big country estate, really. So Wick actually means a dairy farm. Here, 1837, so this is kind of quite far on, but it's still very sparse. There's not really much to note. So you'd actually have to go a long way out of London to really find anything like that now. So it's just a small hamlet. And then this is where it begins to kind of really take on the personality that it still has to this day. So going into, this is in the 1890s, so we begin to see industrialization happening in this Hackney Wick area around the 1740s. We actually had the invention of porcelain in Hackney Wick. But there's two major things that happen. So we have the canals and then we have the railways, and they just transform everything. It's kind of like all of a sudden plugging this random area into this network, which means it buzzes with life. But the way that they carved it up, so we can see that we've got the Hackney Cut navigation down there. And then on the bottom, we've got the Hertford Union Canal. So things that Hackney Wick is very famous for nowadays. But we also have two train lines that come along. So we've got the Great Eastern Railway, which is still there today. That's our lovely overground. But we also have the North London Railway, which kind of bisects what is the border of Victoria Park now. It used to have a very beautiful Victoria Park station, which is sadly no longer with us. It was demolished to make way for the A12 later. But what it effectively does, it turns Hackney Wick into this island. It's cut off in its own space. But then we also have the arrival of Victoria Park in 1845 as well. So it's really pushed out. And what ends up happening, so we have the Metropolitan Buildings Act of 1844. So this says that noxious or offensive trades had to be located away from residential areas. So this obviously is a huge amount of industry, killing animals and then carving up the animals to do things with. So blood boilers, bone boilers, fellmongers, slaughterer of like every animal, and then what you do with all that fat, because that fat gets turned into candles, it gets turned into fuel. But yeah, so this can no longer be around the people of London. So this all gets shipped out, and hey, Hackney Wick, with its isolation, turns out to be the perfect place for it. So, I mean, even at this time, the East End, it's got one of the lowest mortality rates for the rest of compared to the rest of London. It's already suffering a lot of overcrowding, and it's already got insanitary conditions. So as we get on through the century, it just becomes exceptionally polluted. So if you think of all of these dead animals, all of that waste, that all gets chucked into the Hackney Cut. So all of this fat, this grease, there's like decomposing animals. It stinks. It's really, really grim. And so the backdrop to this is people tended to believe the prevailing understanding of disease was that it was caused by miasma, and so that is just bad smell. So if you would smell something disgusting, you would think that would be the explanation for all of this bad disease around you. So in late 1960s, a newspaper described the factories as this malodorous nuisance and a threat to public health through their toxic emissions and susceptibility to fire. So there was a lot of fire in this time. But where that happened, it became this hotbed of industry, and there was one commenter who described it as the Silicon Valley of its time. So we actually had all of these amazing inventions that happened in Hackney Wick. So I've already mentioned porcelain back in the 1700s, but then we have the first dry cleaning in the UK that comes across from France, and this is actually a picture of a Kilsare. This is on White Post Lane. You can still see the building when this happened. We also have the invention of plastic, that's in 1866. We have petrol as well, being refined for the first time for cars in 1874. And, very exciting, big deal, we have from the British Perforated Paper Company, we have the invention of toilet paper in 1880. With all of this industrialisation, we have London's population growing. So over that time, London as a whole doubles. So 2 million in 1851, and then just 50 years later, almost just short of 5 million. So around here in Hackney Wick, again, having to respond to that level of all of these jobs being created, people pouring in, we need housing. So what happens to the housing? So a lot of the land in Hackney Wick is actually partially acquired by some of these big businesses. For whatever reason, they can't use it for the industry. So they begin to then turn it into really cheap, low-grade housing. So they're low-rise, 2 to 3 stories. They're really cheaply constructed. Some of them don't even have foundations or proper drainage, and very crucially, they just have these small outhouses in the yard. From a poverty point of view, the scenario is really not great. So this is Booth's poverty map, 1898. You can see that there's some slightly fancier housing down there towards Old Ford, nice people living amongst the park. But you can really see that in the kind of core of Hackney Wick over here, it's not looking good. So we have Percy Terrace, Humphrey Street and Chapman Road. They're called very poor, casual, chronic want, which sounds horrible. And then Felstead Street is the worst of the worst, which is lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal. Actually on Chapman Road and Chapman Street, so we have these 4 to 6 bedroom houses, and you could have as many as 17 people living in these houses. And also consider this point about the outhouses. So they were all having to use the same toilet that was just located in the yard. If they were washing, it was probably in their own rooms. You know, you'd have the kind of basin in the ewer, but it really was not that much of a thing they were doing. And considering they're going off to these jobs with all of these decomposing animals and sweat and toxic emissions, it's not great for them. So 1879, we have Hackney Wick being described as a district of 6,000 people who had sunk to the lowest depths. So, which I think is a bit harsh. You know, they're inventing all of this great stuff, but apparently they're not to be respected. And there's, you know, if we're talking about those single outhouses, we also have the backdrop of consistent back-to-back cholera epidemics. So cholera is spread through human waste, infecting drinking water. So if you're having 17 people using one outhouse, it's going to be an absolute hotbed for the spread of disease. So we eventually have the Baths and Wash Outhouses Act of 1846 and 1847, which allowed community baths to be built at the public expense. We find 1847, we get London's first public baths in Whitechapel. You actually get the foundation stone was laid by Prince Albert, who was all for it. But it was really slow in the uptake. So by 1865, we only have 20 towns in England and Wales who actually had built anything. So this is not a sudden growth that we're seeing. What actually makes it a lot more popular is the arrival of what we would call Turkish bars, and there was this whole entire movement for Victorian Turkish bars. So it was a very dynamic duo of David Urquhart meeting this other guy, Dr. Richard Barter. They were a really interesting pair. So David Urquhart was very charismatic. People kind of really listened to him when he went and said, everyone should be bathing in these Turkish baths. They really listened to him. But Dr. Richard Barter, he was a bit more introverted, really, really smart guy, and some of the observations he made are really actually hold true today, which is remarkable for the time and the scientific understanding that they had. So David Urquhart, he was actually a British diplomat, and he spent a lot of time in Istanbul. Now, he also suffered from rheumatism, so he was in chronic pain for a lot of his life. He went over to Istanbul, he went into these bars, and he found that they were incredibly effective for helping him deal with that pain. So he writes this book about it and how everyone should be bathing, and Dr. Richard Barter reads it. So he's already seeing through the cholera epidemics that there seems to be this really beneficial impact of heat on the human body when people undergo. Now, he was looking at this very weird technique at the time, so this was the 1830s, where they would get a cold, wet sheet and wrap people in it. And they would get very, very cold at first, but then they would end up breaking out into a fever at the end. So they would get really sweaty after having been wrapped in it. So this idea of this kind of internal core body temperature increasing, he sees that actually that's great for fighting the infection of cholera. So he starts developing these ideas, and then he reads David Urquhart's book on the bars, and he's like, this is a great way to really properly scale this. So they meet and they do a few tests over in Ireland, which is where Richard Barter is from. And they try to build a Turkish bars, and it does not go very well. They don't seem to be able to do it. So David Urquhart finds plans for a Roman bars, and that is something that is a much drier heat, so less steam in it. And actually Richard Barter becomes convinced that it's a much better way anyway, because you can stay in there a lot longer, your core body temperature increases, so he thinks it's just a better way to do things. So they begin to kind of realise that actually all of their theories are really becoming to come true. So this is Malcolm Schifrin, who is like one of the eminent historians on Victorian Turkish baths. He's got a very wonderful book. So before the use of aspirin came widespread at the end of the 19th century, the bath was valued for many by its ability to relieve pain. So did Hackney have any of these wonderful Turkish baths? And yes, they had one, which actually had quite a sad ending, but it was really fab in its time. So this is the Dalston Junction Turkish bars. It was immediately opposite Dalston Junction train station. So you come out and you see this absolute, very beautiful building. So it's got all of these onion domes. It's very oriental looking. And again, that's reflecting this idea of trying to import Turkish culture. It unfortunately opened in 1882, and just 8 years later it was already destroyed by a fire. But to give you an idea of what it might have been like inside, this is one of bars which actually still exists today. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been closed down, they've been demolished, so there's only, I think it's like 8 or 9 living examples of these Turkish bars across the UK now. And here's one where you can actually go, you can have a bath there, it's in Harrogate, and you can see this beautiful Saracenic design in it, so really very, very beautiful. So I would imagine the Turkish baths in Dalston would have been something like that. So back to the Eastway Baths. So it actually used to be called Gainsborough Road. At this point, so this is 1895, we get this area which is where the Eastway Baths are now, and you can see it there. It's called the Hackney Casual Ward. It's where lots of vagrants, tramps, people who just can't, are in debt, they will all get basically housed there, and they'll get put to work. We've got this 1918 report that comes out and looking at the public baths. So are people really kind of taking to them in any grand way? So no, not really. So the bathing habit is distinctly on the increase, they say, but the large majority of people still only bathe about once a year. So it catches on most fervently in London. So people would talk about going on a Friday night visit to the neighbourhood bathhouse. So Eastway Baths in 1935 is opened. It's designed by Percival Holt, who is the engineer in Hackney Council. And this provides what is called a slipper bath and a mechanical laundry. So yeah, you're obviously bathing your body. If you're not washing your clothes as well, then they're going to get grim and dirty. So the two things that really have to go together. There is the idea of adding a swimming pool in there, but that never ends up getting completed in there. The foundation stone is still there, so if you go to the building, it's on the outside and on the front. One of the questions is probably what is a slipper bath? So they look like this. So they tend to look like the baths that they have in period dramas where they're just kind of tin. So this is a very old example, but it eventually just comes to mean a sort of a bathing cabin. This is one of the laundries, so this is what most pictures of. There are unfortunately not that many pictures of the actual slipper baths themselves. There's lots of these women who are all doing their laundry together. So it's a really communal activity. You would take all of your laundry down there, and you would do it with your neighbours, your friends. Here's some of they're called drying cubicles, which I think is great. So I guess the tumble dryers, I think you would just hang everything up in there. Then this one, which is a ironing machine, which I think sounds great. You could be feeding some trousers into it, and I guess they come out really nicely pressed. Here's the roof of them, so they tend to have all of these kind of almost like zigzaggy approaches. So then you can see across Hackney lots of these old laundry buildings, if you see that kind of weird zigzag roof. And yeah, this is the only photo I've managed to find of the actual slipper baths themselves. So this is where people are going to have their bath. So these are all very individualized cabins. You go in, so when you go into the building, you pay your money, you get given your towel, you might get given some soap, and then you'll go in there and you'll sit there by yourself. So it is not communal bathing in that sense. And this is one of the original blueprints. You can kind of see where all of these individual cabins are there. You'd have a female side and a male side. So this is the list of the public bars. It's just a lot of information about what you can get from these different places. And here we can learn a bit more about the central bars, which is in central Hackney at the time. They begin to actually they begin to branch out just from these slipper bars. And you can see that you have vapor bars here and an aerotone therapeutic bath. A vapor bath at that time was again what we would know more as a steam room. So this is beginning to see actually more of a communal element. So as you can see, they would go into the steam room and then they would have a relax afterwards. There is an opportunity for people to talk to one another. And then they also have the vapor plunge. So this is more like the cold plunge that we will enjoy as part of a sauna nowadays. So again, it has a much more of a heat effect. It also has this thing called the aerotone bath, which is a very funky setup. So you probably explain it as it's kind of like a personal hot tub. So it's like there's a lot of so it's air massage, warmth and water, vibrating hydraulic massage. And so things that they say that's good for is muscular rheumatism, fibrosis, arthritis, sciatica, lumbago, muscular strain, varicose vein, ulcers, mental depression, lethargy, high blood pressure and rundown conditions, which, to be honest, is all the things I say that sauna is good for nowadays. So again, it seems to really stick truth. One of the questions is like, well, what do people really think of it? It's actually really hard to find good accounts of anything to do with health, anything to do with hygiene, partly because people just don't really write about washing. It's not like people go to their diaries and they're like, oh yeah, I showered for like 1 hour, or, I used a bath bomb this time. It just is kind of just like lost people by a bit. And this is one such account which does exist. So this is from Louis Heron. He wrote a book called Growing Up Poor in London in 2001, and he reflects on his time. He was born in 1919 in Shadwell. So his mother owns a coffee shop. She grows up in a house with no bathroom. Friday evenings they bathe with their siblings, and that's at home. He comments that he doesn't actually know how his mother washes. So he then eventually gets a job at the Times, late 30s. He moves into a better neighbourhood and they begin to get a private bathroom. I do not see the moral merit in poverty as such. It is not uplifting to live without a bathroom. So this is actually kind of really highlighting one of the reasons we begin to get to talking about the fall of the bars. So where did they go? So that account is that people actually just didn't really like using them. A lot of people didn't like the fact that people would see them using the bars, and it basically made them look poor because they started getting private bathrooms, they started getting nicer housing with plumbing. So if you had to go to the bars, it was it's a way of, I don't know, as much as people would feel proud about going to the job centre, This is a quote from Catherine Aschenberg, who's done a great book on the history of hygiene. And she talks about the working class took up frequent washing only when they had baths at home. The bathhouses built to wash the great unwashed in Europe and America sorely lacked the camaraderie and pleasure that enliven these traditional baths. Intentionally or not, they were joyless, even reproving. Private compartments with a carefully calculated measure of time and warm water could not compete with the ease of bathing at home, once all that was possible with the familiar comfort of not bathing. But I think really interestingly, she's making the point that a reason a lot of these bathing cultures stuck around in other countries was because of this communal element. So with those slipper bars, you're on their own. You're not actually keeping it up because you're seeing people. It feels very isolated. But yeah, if you can make it into this whole ritual where you're bonding with people, then it becomes much more exciting. So back to Eastway. We begin to have what we call the slum clearance. It begins in the 1930s with all this low-grade housing, and then World War II comes along and speeds everything up. So we see a lot of Eastway being bombed. So there's a lot of workshops where everyone were, but very miraculously the bathhouse is unharmed. So let's go back to another reason. So 1948, we also have the arrival of the NHS. So given that a lot of the reason that the public baths came into being was around health, hygiene and trying to prevent disease, we come along with just something which is much better for it, so people can finally access it. We begin to kind of then start seeing what we now know as our foray into pharmaceuticals, modern medicine. So what became of Hackney public baths at that point? So fast forwarding to the modern day, we've got the central baths actually becomes King's Hall Leisure Centre, so you can see that today. And that has now currently closed because actually it's being refurbed. Very pleasingly, it's keeping its cool, but it's also upgrading its steam room and sauna, which I'm very pleased to see. Englefield Road Bath Building, it was opened in 1932 as public baths. It closed in the 1960s, but Hackney Council have now invested in it to safeguard it, and it is now the East and South Asian Community Centre. Chackwell Lane Baths has also become a nursery, which very interestingly is called the Bathhouse Children's Community Centre. So again, all of these places kind of reflecting that original communal bathing centre where people went. They are now becoming community centres. Eastway Baths, so 1994, it was part demolished. So the front and the bathing wing survived, but a lot of the other architecture within inside is completely remodelled. In 2009, there are as many as 321 artist studios clustered in these units. So it then becomes the community centre, which is how I ended up then coming to it. So what happened? Why are these spaces coming back? So we have seen community spaces disappearing. So, this is kind of feels similar to that idea with putting people into the isolated bars, people spending more time at home, people spending more time on their phones. It means that we're beginning to see the people spending less time with each other. So this idea of this kind of the importance of community. So while Victorian bathers purported to take hot air baths for reasons of health or to cleanse themselves, the Victorian Turkish bath almost certainly retained its popularity because it was also extremely relaxing, because it was highly enjoyable, and because it was a social activity which was seen by many as being a positive alternative to the public house and the dangers of alcoholism. This is very early days of what is now the community sauna bars. So this is actually the original founding team. So this is a lot of people I now work with at the British Sauna Society. So they're on the left, and the very smiley lady in the middle, that is Wendy and Mika, who are co-founders of the BSS. Back in the middle, we've got Victoria Maddox, who I worked, and she was really instrumental in bringing the idea of the Hackney Wick sauna bars. It was her idea. We actually originally wanted to do it on Here East and never did it, and then arrived in the old Bath building. We've got Katie there as well, who was another founder. So it began life as a bit of a crowdfunder. We didn't really know if it was going to be popular or not. We thought it would just be a lot of expats who love sauna culture. We just kind of gave it a go and see what was going to happen. And then we came up with this concept. So this is a lovely the original logo designed by Mika. We came up with these 4 pillars of what that kind of idea of community really meant. And again, it was like looking a lot back into the history. So it was the idea that it had to be authentic. So it had to really tick all the boxes of what a good sauna should be. But it had to be local as well. So it really had to belong to that neighbourhood, and it had to kind of really know the people, and the people had to be able to kind of almost like set the language and set the rules there. It has to be affordable, so it has to really not be a privileged spa, and it has to be something that you can go to every week in order to really access the benefits, and it has to be inclusive as well, on the kind of other side of that. So this is when we first moved in. So this is Victoria's sauna here. It was covered in this really scummy, disgusting astroturf. It was a total mess. There was loads of mouldy chairs everywhere. So we went and did just a big clean-up act. There was, again, some building work going on. So very, very humble beginnings, and we started that. I think even on the first day, we were just kind of in a muddy puddle. It was not the best bathing experience, but it was very exciting to be there. So in 6 months, again, talking about we didn't know who was really going to be there, basically built this very beautiful bathhouse. So people just really loved it. Kind of more intensely, we were really beginning to pick up a lot of coverage in press. So we were beginning to sell out. And at that point, we were really like, there is something very exciting here. So interestingly, just at the point of me giving this last talk, I had just been taking this photo. So the Guardian had turned up. I was a bit late for the talk because we've been having to retake this photo and over again. This is the original team. And yeah, we were in, that's the Guardian article. It was quite like quite a monumental one, I think. It was this really point of saying this is a thing that everyone is now doing. It's happening. Get on board with it. And this is, I was also in the Sunday Times magazine, so that's David Baddiel talking about his other sauna culture. So yeah, it was just kind of this runaway success. And so yeah, Community Sauna Bars itself, it's going to 5 sites across London, but we're also seeing about 700 saunas now across the UK, and that's doubling each year. So it's something numbers I keep an eye on at the British Sauna Society. This is our British Sauna Society sauna map, which is where you can find your nearest sauna. There's now 10 saunas across Hackney. So yeah, when I first gave this talk, there was 1. And we're even seeing that communities actually being prescribed saunas as well. So you can go on there and talk to your GP, you can talk to your local link worker, and they'll recommend based on what different things you're going through, whether you should actually be taking sauna to improve those symptoms. So it's become exceptionally full circle. And this is actually another one. So, you know, we had saunas, but this idea of the bathhouse. So Gid, who is here, so she's at the talk today. So she is setting up this fabulous new sauna, which is going to be on Viner Street. I get to talk about it a bit more about afterwards we go to questions. But yeah, this idea of bringing back, and when I've spoken to Gid about it, the idea and the heart of this is very much to have this mixing pot of local people from different backgrounds. It's accessible, and really bringing back all of those different exciting ideas that we saw in these original community bathhouses, and kind of living those true again. So just give some nice shots of very beautiful sauna, and then a beautiful tub as well for the cold plunge. So what are the health benefits of sauna? We've got physical health benefits, so it's incredible for your cardiovascular system. You're probably not realising it when you're sitting in the heat, but it's essentially pumping your heart, your muscles are working. So it's very similar to medium intensity exercise. So it's great if you don't like exercise or you're not particularly good at moving about. Mental health benefits as well. You know, people just talk about a sense of calm, a sense of safety, helping to manage things like trauma and depression as well. So there's some really interesting support groups that are popping up around saunas. And then really interestingly, this idea of social health benefits, which is something that is becoming an increasing topic of conversation. How do we build cohesive communities? How do we span different divides? How do we bring different age ranges to spend time together? And mostly, how do we also combat a lot of the impact that technologies have, negative impacts that technology is having on our sociability? Again, this idea of the sauna rituals and this research that we published this year. So this is, again, this power that that sauna rituals can have to really foster deep belonging. So this was with Dr. Martha Newson at the University of Greenwich. So clear implications for understanding the potential for social prescribing sauna, particularly from those disadvantaged groups who may benefit from the intensity sauna offers to cultivate self-esteem and group membership. In this way, sauna ritual may pose a particularly potent form of social prescribing for those with both physical and mental health challenges. So it really feels like we've come full circle here, and again, this is a lot of the similar language that they were talking about, both in the Victorian era and also in the earlier years of last century. It's again reflecting that quote from Malcolm Schifrin about it being this place to get away from drinking alcohol. There's again lots of people talking about it, this idea of it being the new pub. So, you know, pubs have fallen out of favour, they're not the community places anymore, and we're beginning to see these bathhouses come back as a place for people to go, feel a sense of belonging, with not really having to invest too much. That's